Well, welcome to the second of our SASE Salon pre-conference events. I'm really pleased to welcome Professor Martin Parker from the University of Bristol today to talk about anarchism. I also wanted to say a few words of why we chose Martin and why anarchism. First of all, when I was writing a book recently on work in the digital age, and I described some of the development of apps as the anarchic development of apps, because there was no GDPR, and these things are just happening randomly without being controlled or regulated. One of my colleagues went, "Oh, no, you can't say anarchic app development. That's very negative." And I said, "Why? That's the way it is." And secondly, I had a very large European research project with about 26 partners from 19 European countries. And I went to the European Commission and said, "We are a group of organized anarchy." And this was seen as like, "Oh God, that sounds really bad." And I said, "No, it's really creative. People get to do the research they want to do, and I work out how it all fits together." And so I felt that in the SASE community and in organizational studies, we don't often talk about anarchy or anarchism anymore. And if it is, it's very marginal, it's very negative perception. And this is why I really felt it's important to bring it more to the forefront of some of these debates, because some of the developments we're watching around us are actually very anarchic in positive and negative ways. And so the reason I chose Martin, because I really appreciate his work as an excellent synthesis between understanding the history of anarchy and its various dimensions, but also understanding its practical application both within mainstream organizations, such as business schools, but also in the wider, broader community. And that's also illustrated, for example, in one of his current projects on the inclusive economy in Bristol, looking at Action Research Centre and how the local economy can become more carbon neutral, inclusive and democratic. So Martin, without much further ado, I'd like to hand over to you to tell us why we should shut down the business school and what can anarchic theory help us to understand about the ways of organising. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for all of those attending. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks very much, Jackie. Is that all right? See you, everyone? Happy? Yeah, great. So hello, thank you very much for inviting me. Lovely to be here virtually. Just a couple of words about my background, because it's kind of relevant in that I think I'm really a sociologist of organizations. My training is in sociology and anthropology. My PhD is in anthropology. And I moved to the business school after working in sociology for a while. So in a sense, the sort of subtext to lots of the things I'm going to be talking about is an attempt to kind of rescue a more sociological understanding of organizations and use that as a way of critiquing research and practice within business schools. And that's something I've been chewing at for quite a long time, but it's an important context, I think, for the work. And I suppose the other part of what I'll be trying to do is to rehabilitate the idea of anarchism as an organization theory, as a theory of organizing. There's two aspects to the way that Jackie started I just want to quickly comment on. One is the way in which anarchism is used as a boo word. So, that anarchists are destructive, it's bad bomb throwers and all that kind of stuff, which is not a terribly helpful way of using the word. But also to note that for lots of people, anarchism represents something about disorganization and disorder, that it's seen to be something which is opposed to the construction of institutions, forms of social order and all the rest of it. And I want to push back very strongly against that and suggest that anarchism is actually a theory of organizing, which is about different sorts of orders, about insisting on the kind of relativity of social orders and forms of organization. And that's really what anarchism does for us. It provides us with a much richer sort of tapestry, if you like, of forms of organization, of forms of ordering for us to think about, both as of theoretical interest to people who work in universities, but also in terms of their practical application in the world. So, oh, it's not moving. Wait a second. Oh, there we go. Yes. So anarchism, this strange mutable term, a term that very often produces all sorts of effects. When I mention to people that I'm interested in it, sometimes they think I'm kind of joking, that this is just a sort of me showing my bum in public. It's a particular kind of sloganeering or something like that. Or they regard me to be a sort of an enemy in a way, someone who's trying to tear things down, who's trying to destroy things in a sort of Sex Pistols-ish sort of way. I suppose part of my interest in this actually does come as a teenage punk. I hadn't really thought about that very much, but I was. And one of the first albums I bought was Never Mind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols. So there is a kind of an element to that, I suppose, but that's not what I'm trying to do here. Now, I want to just start off by thinking about, well, where do we learn about organising? And I think for the purposes, I mean, there's a variety of ways we might answer this kind of question, but the purpose of this talk, I'm going to be concentrating on the kind of schools that exist within universities that teach particular conceptions of organisation. Schools of commerce and business and management, schools of public administration and politics. Commerce, business and management, obviously teaching about the private sector in the broadest terms, public administration, politics about something called the public sector. But in both of those cases, there tends to be a sense, I think, in which questions about other political theories, anarchism, for example, are really not routinely discussed. So I used to work at Warwick Business School about 10 years ago. I don't think there's anybody teaching about anarchism at Warwick Business School. And indeed, the very idea of teaching about anarchism at Warwick Business School might strike quite a lot of people as being strange, as just being a deliberately provocative and stupid thing, in the way that, you might say, why doesn't Warwick Business School teach about, I don't know, gardening or something like that? As if anarchism has nothing to do with the practice of business organization. The history of business schools is kind of important in this regard, because the way that they've grown is very much shaped by a North American tradition. I'll talk about that in a bit, but their earliest forms are mostly Northwest European. These are some of the older business schools in Northwest Europe, and most of them were attempts to very often pull together a curriculum which was a kind of a combination of bookkeeping, of various ways in which we might think about accounts and so on, together with a certain attempt to moralize the activity of business. So quite a lot of these business schools are attempts to, if you like, construct the idea of what the business person is, of who they're supposed to be, and what their nature as a cadre of individuals in the industrializing states of Northwestern Europe should be. It's, if you look back at the history of this kind of stuff, that the business person and the business is a very tricky category. It still is in lots of ways. But many of these early schools are kind of intervening not only in the kind of machineries, if you like, of business, but also in the way in which the business person might think about themselves. The Americans, of course, get in on the act pretty quickly, places like Harvard and Wharton and all the rest of it. And this is when, business schools might start to move towards the big time. But it's kind of important, again, to note that the early business schools weren't simply technocratic in the sense that they were teaching a particular body of skills. They are doing some of that stuff, but are very often focused around a particular conception of moral education too, around cultivating a certain kind of business person, a certain sort of business class. And of course, this is particularly important to recognize at the point that this is being done from the sort of 1870s onwards. A period in the US where you're seeing incredibly high levels of concentration of wealth and power, huge huge, the Gilded Age probably captures it quite nicely, doesn't it? This idea of, groups of families, mostly on the East Coast, who dominate certain kind of industries and leading to gigantic forms of inequality. And in many ways, a kind of legitimacy crisis for business itself, which is exacerbated by the Great Depression and the activities of the various attempts to regulate business and to split up monopolies and all the rest of it. So in a sense, many of these schools are kind of emerging into a context in which their activities are seen to be quite suspicious, and consequently there is a need for a kind of moral rearmament. Now the business school market is just gigantic. It's enormous. These are old figures, and I've been trying to search for some more reliable ones, but this is from 2011. AACSB estimates there's nearly 13,000 business schools globally, with about 3,000 in India alone. And the amount of cash that is moving through these places is also gigantic. If you do a rough guesstimate, looking at kind of average sized business schools globally must have a fee income of at least $400 billion. And that's just the fee income. That's not discussing, textbooks and the selling of gowns and consultancy and Christ knows what else is associated with that whole kind of business school complex. So basically, business schools are big business. This is a really central part of the higher education system globally. Indeed, if you look at some figures from places like Eurostat and UNESCO and so on, you can get an estimate of something between 1 in 7 and 1 in 5 higher education students globally studying variants of business management. So, including things like accounting and marketing and all the rest of it. So just pause for a second and think about that. Between 1 in 7 and 1 in 5 students in higher education globally are studying some variant of business and management. That's an astonishing degree of concentration. A single subject area which really has become not exactly hegemonic, but certainly dominant in terms of the conception of what higher education is and does. So what do business schools do? That's a picture of shiny London Business School for those of you who don't recognize it. Business schools, and this is the slide that usually gets most business school people quite upset. I think business schools do, a couple of things, but one of them is largely to sell the idea that business education is an individual good. It's a private good. This was the strapline stuff for London. And of course, as you'll notice, it's basically it's an appeal to the individual consumer, if you like. You don't see business schools advertising themselves usually in terms of the collective good. Normally, it's an appeal to the individual to invest in themselves. That was the phrasing that was used at Warwick a decade ago. Invest in yourself, and essentially the investment will pay off in terms of income returns or higher social status or a new job or whatever it might be. So, the conception of the business school, in a sense, is about the selling of private goods. In substantive terms, I think business schools mostly teach these three things. They firstly teach about corporations. Corporations are the model forms of organizing for business schools. Other forms of organization clearly exist and are recognized, but very often the way that teaching and case studies are constructed assumes that the corporation is the dominant and the most important model, and that any other organizational form really seeks to become a corporation. So, accounts of innovation or growth, whatever it might be, essentially are focused around the idea of the corporation as the poster kid. And that really means, because of the legal structure of the corporation, that really means that questions of shareholder value assume a particular kind of primacy, that shareholder value is seen to be the dominant conception of value. Value, a complex term, and perhaps one that we'll discuss later, but shareholder value is then seen to be the form of value that matters most, that is valued most. Secondly, and commensurate with this focus on corporations, there is an assumption that growth is always good, so that the criteria of success for any organization is that it grows in terms of number of employees or number of products or number of territories it operates in or whatever else. Big is beautiful. The bigger something is, the better it is, the more interesting it is. So you can see the corporations and growth things, both in terms of it, this is sort of a particular kind of economic imperative, if you like, both within organizations and within states, but also in terms of this idea that the really interesting and important organizations to be looking at are the biggest ones. And consequently, the corporations become, they're the ones in the center of the view, if you like. And then thirdly, of course, business schools teach about management. That's a particular practice and cadre, a practice of engineering and coordinating the activities of others, but also a cadre of individuals who sit at the top of organizations, ideally very large organizations, and who are well rewarded for ensuring that these very large organizations grow and dominate particular kind of markets. Now, that embeds a particular assumption, of course, about hierarchy, the idea that most people can't manage themselves. They're incapable, the poor stupid things, of looking after themselves. So they need a category of people called managers in order to ensure that they can coordinate themselves, because the managers do that work for them. So it embeds hierarchy. So in a sense, and this is a very quick way of talking about 95% of the teaching and research in business schools 95% of the time. I'm obviously not talking about the people in this audience. Embeds particular ideas about the centrality of the corporate organizational form, the economics of growth, and the necessity of hierarchy. So who's it for? Who's this kind of education for? Well, it seems fairly obvious to me that it's for those who benefit from or want to benefit from a standard model of global capitalism. That's essentially what business schools are reproducing. But yet we know, and I'll do this quickly, that capitalism is, whatever we might say about it, not a perfect economic system. Capitalism at present is embedding staggering levels of inequality, eye-watering levels of inequality, which make the American Gilded Age seem relatively mild by comparison. Capitalism is also generating a kind of hegemony of large global firms, which are dominating in certain kinds of markets. Oxfam produced quite a nice, it was a list of the 100 biggest institutions, if you like, 100 biggest institutions on the planet, and 49 of them were states and 51 of them were corporations. I think the largest corporation to come in terms of turnover was Walmart, which has an economy bigger than that of Spain. So effectively what we're looking at is a form of hegemony, which is now placing the corporation in a position of global coordination, which makes it very often more important than states. Thirdly, capitalism is producing all sorts of externalities which are producing a gigantic ecological crisis in terms of, say, for example, plastics. Yeah. And finally, as if we needed reminding of this point, capitalism is also producing climate change. The sad picture of the last polar bear dying on the last iceberg should just remind us that the crisis that's facing us right now is a species-threatening crisis, and it is one that's directly caused by the current economic system and the organizations that operate within it. So, business schools, that's what they're reproducing then. Business schools, if we want to put it in simple Marxist terms, aren't engaged in education in some general liberal sense. They're engaged in the reproduction of a particular kind of ideology, a particular set of ways of thinking about what organization is and what organization could be. And this, to me, is profoundly dangerous for all of us, human and non-human, living on this planet. And I'm not saying business schools are the only place in which this ideology is being produced and reproduced, but they're clearly, as I've evidenced before, one of the major parts of it. Now, of course, there's lots of talk about alternatives. There's endless discussions of alternatives. And and they're becoming more and more heated. And within the business school, we see this kind of stuff manifested in talk about corporate social responsibility, ideas about diversity, sustainability, and ethics, and so on. So these tend to be, if you like, ameliorative in the sense that corporate social responsibility kind of still assumes the corporation. It just assumes that corporations can declare purposes and somehow that'll be okay. So these, I suppose, this first set of alternatives to me is really a kind of a fairly soft internal form of reformism. But at the same time, we also see in the kind of marginal parts of critical management studies and other places an interest in a variety of other forms of political and social theory: feminism, socialism, communism, green stuff, and so on, post-colonialism. And the one at the front of that, I've put there, anarchism. So anarchism as a way of thinking about politics and organizing, which I think has some powerful lessons to teach us about not only the possibilities for our future collectively, but particularly about the kinds of things that we should be doing within business schools. Because what anarchism kind of focuses us on, I think, well, lots of these radical theories, but I'm going to focus on anarchism for these purposes today, focuses us on the fact that these are practices as well as theories, that many of the forms of organization that we might be interested in and might be sponsoring as alternatives to the kind of market managerialism sold by business schools are forms of organizing which are very often much more localized and much more grassroots. They're forms of organizing that many people engage in. Anybody who's interested in different forms of politics or prefiguring different ways in which we might live our lives is involved in various forms of organizing. And many of these forms of organizing have been influenced by intellectual currents like anarchism, socialism, feminism, and so on. Anarchism still has such a bad name, though. You know, it's imagined to be something engaged in by destructive, alienated 20-somethings who just want to smash the windows in their local McDonald's. And I'm not trying to say that there aren't people who call themselves anarchists who do that stuff, but I am interested in, if you like, reclaiming some of the core ideas of anarchism rather than simply sloganeering about anarchism. I suppose in that sense, I do depart from the Sex Pistols, whose understanding of anarchist theory wasn't necessarily particularly sophisticated. Now, I think it's one of the most misunderstood words in political theory. And very often this misunderstanding, I think, is really foundational in the sense that I don't think anarchists are against organization. Indeed, I think anarchism is probably the most extended conversation that we have about how we organize. So if we look back to the last 200 or so years of anarchist thinking, back to the kind of classical anarchism of the early 18th, I beg your pardon, late 18th, early 19th century, these are very often texts which are encouraging us to think hard about organizing, but think about it without preconditions, without assumptions. So very often anarchists are extraordinarily interested in how things are put together, how committees and votes and villages and cities and so on, how these things are assembled. But they're often asking very hard questions about the kind of assumptions that are conventionally made when those things are assembled in the societies that most of us are familiar with. This is, I borrowed this from somebody else, but this is a kind of a quick table of anarchisms. And this isn't going to be a lecture in which I move through a whole series of different anarchist theory, but I think it provides us with sort of a helpful way of thinking about three very broad periods of anarchism, because anarchism, you know, like socialism, communism, feminism, and all those other isms, isn't one thing. It's a coalition of ideas. But we can talk about a broad distinction between the kind of classical anarchists, so people like Kropotkin and Bakunin and others, who very often are articulating a kind of anthropology of the human, which assumes that cooperation is a kind of a natural state, and that forms of conflict and exploitation are very often imagined to be more unnatural states, if you like, ones that are produced by social order. And consequently, what anarchists need to do is to find ways of rescuing, of recuperating our natural cooperativeness. But they can then move to a kind of phase which is usually from the sort of the 1960s, a sort of practical operationalization almost of anarchism, if you like, which is very often focusing on small spaces, on the ways in which, I don't know, allotments or cafes or social centers or whatever might be organized. But very often this kind of practical anarchism is staying clear of the sort of the big criticisms of the state that classical anarchists were very involved with, and instead trying to focus more on the ways in which everyday practices could construct different ways of living and being together. And then finally, we have this sort of term post-anarchism, which is very often a way of referring to the kind of influence of various forms of post-structuralist thought on anarchist categories, and is often a way of starting to think about how anarchism might be lived in daily life, what being an anarchist in daily life might mean, in terms of identities and rules and subjectivities and so on, with a particular focus, if you like, on the more hidden operations of power, rather than simply seeing power as something which is out there in the state with the bosses, to start thinking about the ways in which power relations operate through and within us. So anarchism is multiple. It's varied. It's not one thing, and it reflects the kind of the histories of 200-year history of anarchism, and particularly its kaleidoscopic present. Very often reflects the kind of concerns that people might have in particular localities or with particular kinds of identities and politics. In a sense, I think it's almost more useful nowadays to specify what kind of anarchist you are, what form of anarchism you're mostly interested in, because there are a whole variety of different flavors. But I think that there are nonetheless, to all these different flavors, there are, if you like, some key problems, some key issues that anarchists try to address themselves to. One of them is really about that which they oppose. So for classical anarchists, very often it was about the state or about the church or about the educational system or something like that. It was like, selecting what seemed to be a hierarchical, authoritarian organization, institution, and identifying that as a problem that needed to be pushed back against. In more abstract terms, this also manifests as a suspicion of hierarchy, because of course all of those, state, church, education, and other forms of human association are very often predicated on ideas about hierarchy, on the idea that there are some people who deserve to be at the top making the decisions and other people who merely follow them, that there's a kind of a necessary division within human beings which produces particular sorts of divisions. And this leads us to kind of discussions of authority and legitimacy. So, who has the legitimate authority within any given social structure? More generally, there's also this kind of interest, I think, with lots of anarchists in the relationship between freedom and constraint. What kinds of freedoms, what does freedom mean? What kind of freedoms can we employ? And what kind of constraints might be necessary in order to guarantee particular kinds of freedoms? And that leads into lots of interesting discussions about coordination or federation. In other words, how do you maximize the amounts of freedoms that particular individuals or groups or communities have at the same time as you coordinate their activities on larger scales, or make sure that the freedoms that they enjoy don't impinge on the freedoms that other people enjoy. And most generally, I think, the relation between theory and practice. This is an endless discussion within anarchism. In other words, very few anarchists really just talk about this as a theory. It's not imagined to be, like institutional theory or something like that, just a way of thinking about the world. This is intended to be a practice that intervenes in the world. Now, in a way, I think that what anarchism is encouraging us to do is to sort of think about organizing without guarantees. It's encouraging us to think about organizing as a social process, one that embeds particular ideas about power and privilege and status and reward and all the rest of it. But then to kind of unpick that in order that we can think about how forms of social organization are produced that we might find more desirable rather than simply assume that they're somehow inevitable. Because when we learn about organizing at business schools and schools of politics and public administration and so on, effectively what we're very often learning is something about the inevitability of particular organizational forms, about the ways in which certain ideas about the way that human beings come together are embedded into the curriculum, into research, into our objects of inquiry, and so on. So sometimes for those who are familiar with contingency theory, organization theory, I kind of think about anarchism as a kind of radical contingency theory, one in which all the contingencies are open. And we could talk about, leadership or decision-making or proximity or occupation of roles, the rest of it, as all of them being potentially variables, all of which might be combined and recombined in different sorts of ways to achieve particular kinds of political effects. Because organizing is not the same as management. And this is really important for my overall argument, I think. Management is a particular form of organization. Organization is the umbrella term. And anarchists are interested in organization. They would regard management as a fairly constrained organizational form, one in which a particular category of people coordinated the activities of others. So organizing is the umbrella term, and organizing clearly varies. It varies historically, spatially, nationally, ethnically, and so on. The evidence of sociology, anthropology, history, and so on is that the way that human beings and things come together is hugely varied. So organizing then becomes my most, my kind of most useful concept in a sense, thinking about it as a way of thinking about patterning, systems, order, assemblages, and so on. So organizing is the kind of the generous concept that allows us to think about the ways in which different sorts of assemblages of people and things are constructed. But yet within schools of business, they only teach about one very restricted form of organizing. And they don't teach about a whole variety of alternative forms of organizing, which are only called alternatives because they're usually not taught within business schools in this particular context. So, this is a kind of a fairly random list of different ways in which, of different forms of organization that usually don't find much of a home within business schools, because business schools are mostly interested, as I've said, about teaching pro-growth market managerialism. And so even, a very common organizational form, like a cooperative, for example, is relatively rare to find on a business school curriculum. It's, I won't tell the story now, I don't really have time, but suffice it to say that according to the International Cooperative Association, something like 1/7 of the world's economy has some relation to cooperative organizational forms. It is staggering the extent to which most business schools just ignore this stuff, regarding it perhaps as being old-fashioned or hippie or too small to be interesting or something. Now, I guess the overall argument here is one about diversity. This is a little quote from the Royal Horticultural Society's Gardener's Encyclopedia of Plants and Flowers. And it's a lovely book which has lots and lots of pictures of different kinds of plants in it. Yeah, and there's big plants and small plants and plants that like salt and plants that can move a bit and plants that can live underwater and all sorts of different kinds of plants. And the idea is to document the gigantic variety of different kinds of plants, not to assume that only some plants are interesting. And I guess that's a sort of an interesting, well, for me, an interesting reflection on what business schools are doing, because effectively business schools are focusing on one very narrow category of organizing. When what I'm pushing for, and I think what anarchists are pushing for too, is a much broader consideration of experimental approaches, if you like, of pluralist or diverse or different approaches to solving the kind of problems that face us, rather than assuming that one dominant form of organization is the answer to all our problems, when in fact it might well be that form of organization is causing our problems in the first place. Quite a few years ago, I, together with some colleagues, did a book which we called the Dictionary of Alternatives, and it was intended to be this gigantic sort of demonstration of the sheer variety of ways in which human beings had thought about organization. The subtitle was Utopia and Organization. And we wanted this to be a book in which we talked about actually existing co-ops and mutuals and partnerships and B Corps and Christ knows what else, as well as thinking about alternative organizations like circuses and criminal groups and imaginary utopias and all sorts of stuff. And we wrote this book, and it was 250,000 words in the end. It was this gigantic dictionary, and the publishers said, it's too big, 250,000 words, we can't publish 250,000 words. And so I then had to spend a very dispiriting couple of months cutting it down to 120,000 words. And the 120,000 words that we got down to was this, which was this still a pretty big fat book with a whole series of different ways of thinking about organizing. And two of those entries are of interest to us here, but only two. One of them on anarchism, obviously, but also management, because management's a form of organization as well. And I'm not denying that management has a place in organizing. It's just that it's not the only one. And in a sense, I suppose this book now, probably the most useful thing about this book is that slide, actually. It's the idea that management is only one organizational form amongst many. So this is why I push towards, and I keep on wittering on about this, bulldozing the business school and setting up a school for organizing. This is more than reform. This isn't about teaching CSR or diversity. This involves blowing the old stuff up and starting something different, a school for organizing. A school for organizing that teaches about the wildly diverse ways in which organizing gets done, and that adopts, I think, a broadly anarchist set of assumptions about the variety of ways in which organizing can get done, that doesn't assume that there are certain conceptions of leadership or hierarchy, or that there is one measure of efficiency or value, or any of that kind of stuff. But the idea, and to twist Bruno Latour here, that organizing is a form of politics made durable. And if we start off with that kind of formulation, I think that the university can get a proper discipline and not just a finishing school for capitalism. And that, oh, that's not quite it. I thought that was the last slide. Sorry, not quite the last slide. So this is my school for organizing, and I'll be accepting job applications after this lecture. Thank you very much for listening. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. That was a brilliant presentation of a lot of very complex ideas.
A lot of stuff in there, I know. Sorry about that.
It's great. It's excellent. You know, it's a clear focus on the argument in the book, and also a perspective for those who may be less familiar with the kind of history of anarchism. Right. Is anybody got, I've got some questions coming up, but if you have any questions, would you like to put them in the chat or raise your hand? And I'll be able to go over to you. So the first person, we have Brendan O'Rourke from Dublin. So Brendan, fire ahead.
Well, we've been organizing ourselves in the little mini room to ask questions. But one of the kind of things that came up was, I suppose, well, maybe I'll put it from my experience. I'm what I call a recovering economist. I was initially trained as an economist, and being interested in the economy, I didn't find economic departments a great place to be, and actually found the business school was a space in which one could be less ideological than economics anyway. So I suppose I kind of have a lot of sympathy for the critical idea of bulldozing the business school, but fear that the business school is actually being bulldozed in the direction of making it more of a capitalist finishing school. And I wonder, so I veer from wanting to bulldoze the bits I don't like, but also fearing that without defending it against the bulldozing from the other direction, there'll be less of a space rather than more of a space to engage in critical work. So I just thought I'd share that and see what your response might be. Thanks.
Thanks, Brendan. And it's a great question. I mean, I do think that sort of you're raising questions of political strategy here, essentially, aren't you? It's sort of, whether it's better to fight the good fight from inside or from outside. I oscillate on those questions. I think that the spaces that are opened up by critical work within business schools are noisy but ineffective. As I've said, I think there's a curious sense in which this sort of the critical fringe is almost a kind of a sort of a decoration, a demonstration of just how tolerant the business school is when normal business just carries on in the background. It's not like we're actually changing the machinery in any way. And it's at points like that I wonder whether the project of building a different kind of an economy, a green, inclusive, democratic economy, might be better conducted in other spaces, outside these outside business schools with all their kind of constraints and ideological problems. But at the same time, you're kind of right, just sort of exodus of the critical people from the business school sounds like it might be a tactical mistake as well. I don't know. I flip-flop on that, depending on how depressed I'm feeling about universities on any given day. But it's a great question.
Yeah, we've got some follow-up, but I'll save mine to the end. Crawford Spence, you got your hand up, and would you like to introduce yourself as well, please?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Jacqueline. Hi, Martin. Yeah, I'm Crawford Spence. I'm a professor of accounting at King's College London, so very much in the business school community. But share Martin's views to a large extent, and by your analysis completely, Martin. But I wonder to what extent the problems you frame it as a problem of different organizational templates and the domination of one particular sort of organizational template within business schools, that of kind of management, if you like. To what extent do you think that's a function of a sort of, I don't know if it's a deeper problem, but maybe the sort of intellectual domination of economics or particular forms of economic thinking within business schools? So if I look around business schools, and particularly my own area, obviously accounting or finance, it's very much dominated by a sort of microeconomic view of the world, which comes along with particular assumptions about growth hierarchy, which you have highlighted as well. And I know those economic intellectual frameworks are maybe less prevalent in departments in which you work in, say like a Department of Organisation Studies, or maybe even the Department of Strategy, but they exist in different forms there as well. So to what extent is this really a problem of economics, do you think?
Yeah, no, I think again, great question, Crawford. And I think you're right to some extent. Let me just play that back in a couple of different ways, though. One is that I think what kind of interests me, in a sense, is the way in which we might roll back some of the distinctions that universities currently make. So it's always fascinated me to look at the names of different departments and what subjects they're supposed to represent. So, if you look at sort of medieval universities and what they used to teach, the way in which they organized knowledge, if you like. And clearly one of the ways in which the contemporary university organizes knowledge is to separate politics from economy. When, of course, political economy was an entirely recognizable discipline within, say, the Victorian University. So that separation of economics from other things, from other questions, seems to be profoundly worrying. And I suppose that's the institutional example of that sort of Polanyi's disembedding thing, isn't it? This idea of kind of pulling the economy out of a set of other social relations. So I think that's probably true. But of course, that's not a reason for not discussing the economy or economics, is it? It would be a way of kind of reconfiguring economics so that it was necessarily connected to other disciplines in ways that, if you like, constrain some of its madness, its model-making madness, something like that. I guess the other thing that it's worth saying about, and I'm not sure how this works in other countries, but I mean, as you know, in the UK, economics departments have very often been swallowed by business schools and become kind of finance in a sense. And so the really, you know, say at Bristol, for example, there's a freestanding economics department that will want nothing to do with our shiny new business school, because they would see that as the death of economics. And so, you know, the subject itself is almost self-sealing in a way now, isn't it? And the versions of economics that we get within the business school are often highly financialized versions of economics, and usually very ahistorical ones too. A bunch of people who actually don't know very much about the history of economics, which is, you know, much more heterodox and interesting than most economists realize. That wasn't really an answer to the question. All I did was replay your question back at you in a few different ways. Sorry.
Okay, I think Greg's got to leave us. Greg from Australia.
See you, Greg.
Thank you very much. Thanks for participating, Greg. Okay, shall I hand over to Martin James? Crawford, you didn't have anything you want to come back on there, did you? Okay, cool. Martin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm a lecturer at Birmingham Business School at the University of Birmingham, so I'm very much in the business school trenches. I've come across Martin once or twice. I was at Warwick Business School as a PhD, so yeah, I've very much been through the ringer of the modern business school in various senses. And I'm doing a lecture to MBA students at the weekend, block teaching, and one of the things that I'm talking about there is employee voice and the role and the potential of employee voice. One of the messages that I'm going to try and get across is that the destruction of the employee voice over the last 20 or 30 years, I believe, has been a bad thing. It's not been in the interest of British business and the British economic performance. I think it's actually been quite destructive, and the deconstruction of the avenues for employee voice hasn't been in the UK kind of PLC interest. It's actually been a bad thing. And of course, selling that message to MBAs is a challenge, but I think it's an important one to take on anyway. And then that leads then to a question of, well, what could or should employee voice entail and look like? And I suppose the question that this leads to is, if you think about how businesses are run versus how democracies are supposed to function and the virtues of democracies, democracy itself is now quite tainted in light of the things that have happened in the last 5 or 10 years. So is democratizing the workspace, democratizing business school and decision making, is that a potential avenue out of the situation that we find ourselves, or might that actually, is that better seen as kind of a part of the problem in terms of how we move forward?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I've often, sometimes when I'm teaching about this kind of stuff, I talk about democracy and get the students to agree that democracy is a good thing, you know, because it's motherhood and apple pie. Of course, democracy is a good thing, you know. It's you know, people having a voice and all that kind of stuff, and then sort of nudge at the idea that, so why is it then that workplaces aren't places where democracy happens? Yeah, it's almost like, does democracy stop at some point and something else then starts to happen? Because by doing that, you can then take a sort of an universal value, one that most people nod at most of the time, don't they? You know, it's a good thing, and then ask questions about, you know, when it is deficient or when it seems not to be operating. There's that I've forgotten his name now. Was it Marshall, the one who talked about different conceptions of democracy? And one of his is industrial, I think it's Marshall, industrial democracy. So this idea that, you know, if you want to understand a fully democratic polity, then it's not enough to think about it in terms of electoral democracy. You also need to think about it in terms of cultural democracy. And I forgot what the other ones are, but one of them is definitely industrial. So pushing at that seems to be a smart move, doesn't it? And it's also kind of a way of, if you like, sort of tricking people into admitting that there are systemic democratic deficiencies within most organizations most of the time. And this is because of the remarkably hierarchical set of assumptions and obediences that are built into the way that those institutions are assumed to operate. So I think, I don't know, it depends how you teach, doesn't it? But quite often I'll start off with something that everybody likes, something that people say is a good thing. It's like I teach business ethics a lot, and so, you can start, or corporate social responsibility or something, and you can start with, a general statement about it's a good idea to be fair, isn't it? Something like that. And everyone go, yes, 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 yes. And then you go, well, why is this not fair then? Why is that not okay? Because starting with those kind of generalities seems to be quite a useful way. A bit like, I suppose, I'm doing with the university itself, kind of saying, universities should be interested in lots of different things, but this part of the university is only interested in market managerialism, something along those lines. So why is that then? Why aren't we teaching about all of these other different things? Because you wouldn't do that, I use that example sometimes. If you're in a history department and you only taught about the 17th and 19th centuries, then people would be a bit puzzled by why that was the case. So we work in, schools of business, and we don't teach about most business forms. We only teach about some of them.
Cool. I've got a question from Greg Bamber referring to Lenin, and after that, there's going to be a question from myself and Malu that came out of the discussion we had in our session. Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Jackie, and thank you.
Can you introduce yourself for people who don't know you?
Okay. I'm Greg Bamber. I'm based at Monash University, which is in Melbourne in Australia, but also in several other countries. It's almost like a multinational enterprise, and having campuses around the world. The favourite one is in Tuscany, where I think Jackie and I are going to meet in a few weeks' time for a gig there. But my comment on your last remarks, Martin, and I think your commentary is very interesting and thought-provoking in general, but just reminds me of visiting a factory in Germany some years ago where the graffiti on the gate said something like, "Abandon democracy, all ye who enter here." You can vote outside in the broader democracy, but once you're inside the factory or the business school, you're subject to the hierarchy and so on, which leads me to my question, paraphrasing Lenin, if you like, that many of us locked into hierarchies and performance management systems. In the short term, what is to be done? What should we or can we be doing in practice, Martin?
Yeah. So there's always two ways to answer that question, aren't there? So I'll assume that you mean what is to be done in our role as employees of universities, mostly in business schools, because of course there's lots of other stuff that we could be doing. We could be on the streets with XR, we could be standing as political candidates, etc., etc. And that, it's important to recognize the doubleness of any response in that, isn't it? In terms of what we do within the institutions that we work within and for, I think again there's a couple of different things. One is, we do have the license to teach mostly what the fuck we want, And so, for example, when I'm talking about alternative organizations, I very often would talk about a particular example. One of my favorite ones is SUMA, the co-op in in Yorkshire, which employs 300 people now. It's been going since 1976. It's a very successful national business, does whole food distribution, all the rest of it. Everybody in the organization is multi-skilled, and they all get about £10,000 more than the national annual wage right now. It's a successful business by any criteria, and it's a co-op. It's a worker co-op, a fully democratic worker co-op. So, if you give people examples of the ways in which these kinds of forms of democracy can exist, so then the question is, well, why isn't your organization more like this? Why do you have to abandon democracy when you get there? So that's the classroom. But the other thing is, and I've been possessed with this for a very long time, is, people who claim to be interested in radical alternatives and so on really should be occupying positions within universities and business schools in particular in order to enact those kinds of changes, in order to produce the idea of a different kind of school. Because it's no good us just writing more sodding articles for journals that nobody ever reads and imagining somehow that that's going to have some kind of effect on the politics of the institutions we work in. We need people who believe the kinds of things that hopefully we do, to be sitting as deans, to be trying to mediate some of these pressures, to be encouraging a more diverse way of understanding the curriculum and research and all the rest of it, and certainly to be pushing towards ways of upsetting the current smug metrics ranking system, whether that's of business schools or departments or anything else. It's this stuff badly needs to be pushed back at. So yeah, you need to. I think this. I applied for the job of being head of the new business school at the University of Bristol, and apparently I was longlisted, but I wasn't shortlisted. And I think that was largely because I was outlining a 10-point manifesto for the business school that I wanted to see. But I want people like that applying for jobs, telling me what the business school of the future should look like, a business school which is focused on zero carbon, on inclusion, et cetera, et cetera. And that seems to be vital, doesn't it? Rather than just more Muppets and relays who see their job as maximizing income to the university.
Good for you. I'm sorry you didn't get the job. If I might just make one quick last comment.
Yeah, go on.
Looking around business schools, I can see a few examples of people who have been very critical, who become deans or in positions of power, and they seem to very quickly get absorbed into the hierarchy.
There's the danger.
Right. What did the Who sing about? Here's your new boss, same as the old boss, kind of thing.
I'll get fooled again. Yeah.
Because the systems, they've got to produce certain return on investment, and they're locked into
there's a whole
generating money. It's easier said than done, I guess, if you like.
Absolutely. There's a whole series of systemic problems. But if your question is what should we do?
Yes.
That's one of the things we do, isn't it?
Yes.
As well as the other forms of politics. Somebody said rather beautifully, if I had have got the job of head of the business school, it would have been really exciting, but it would have ended like Thelma and Louise. So I'd have been driving the university over a cliff, cackling like mad with a bottle of Jack Daniels in one hand. But we had a great time.
Yes. Good on you.
And you'd have got employed Brad Pitt to be what, Dean of Research or cinematography or something. Okay.
Why did you need Brad Pitt when you got me?
Indeed.
Velu wanted to ask a question, and we wanted to also follow up from our group discussion that Brendan raised. So, for example, I'm in economic sociology. I did my PhD, but there's more people in a business school talking about work and employment than in a sociology department, where they only wanted to talk about David Beckham's handbag, celebrity culture, body dysmorphia. So the body and celebrities were the top topics in the sociology department, and work was really rather banal. And going to a business school, I found much more interesting than, unfortunately, we're nice colleagues in sociology, but not my cup of tea. And when I was telling my friends or peers in France, where I did that's half of the PhD, they were like, zut alors, like, oh my God, why would a sociologist work in a business school? Because in France, they have a very, very different historical tradition of, École des Mines and all of the business schools. That's a very particular, very narrowly defined type of education that's a million miles away from social sciences. And I think it's the kind of fact there was the migration has been out of sociology into the business school because it's a more receptive place to some of the things we want to talk about. That was one thing. And Velu, can I bring you in as well from our discussion, so you get a chance to say, what did you want? You want to raise a point too?
No, it was just along those lines of why is the business school high? Why is the business school so diverse, not just in terms of backgrounds and different disciplines, but also is very international. People like me and people like so many colleagues coming from, different parts of the world. And it becomes this very privileged place to work and it helps with our careers, with our CVs, and especially the UK becomes suddenly this very prestigious market for academics, and the business school is pretty much on the top of the ranking. And I just wonder why is it, if it's so hard to push against the mainstream, why are we finding that diversity in the business school not perhaps being something that is productive or is bringing any concrete change through, because we all think diversity is good, right? And to bring change, we need diversity, but it's not happening.
Martin, do you want to that? And if there's any last question, can you raise your hand? And I think then we'll be closing up and going to the socialized space if you want. Okay, Will's got a question.
Yeah.
So would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, Malu's one of my colleagues here at Bristol, and so we've had lots of conversations about precisely these things. And there is, I think, a really interesting paradox in the kind of the yes, you're right, the diversity of business schools very often, particularly in terms of their sort of, you know, the varieties of languages that are spoken and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, there seems to be a profound conformity beneath that. It's almost like, you know, kind of a diversity decoration, even to the extent that well, I better not be too rude about university management at Bristol, but, you know, sometimes diversity has now become a word which is just a way of talking about recruiting international students, which, you know, strips diversity of any of its kind of politics and power. It effectively just becomes a kind of marketing strategy for making sure that you get people who are paying from lots of different countries, which doesn't really seem to be the point of using a word like diversity in the first place. You might as well just talk about global customers.
Okay, the last question we'll hand over to Will.
Well, I think, I mean, you really sort of partly just said it, but it's just a comment as much as anything. But just to add, we were talking about, it's interesting that you'll have in a management department, for example, people who are sociologists or, for example, who study industrial relations. And they may be from an industrial relations background, they maybe research stuff to do with unions and collective agreement and stuff like that. But then they'll be teaching, I don't know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs in an HR course, you know, so it attracts people who have diverse interests, do diverse research in relation to employment, but then, you know, which is kind of the point I think you were making, you know, you teach a particular type of course, you know, a particular type of management. And that, you know, so for example, I really like the question, the main argument that you make, which is in a way, if we're teaching organisation studies, why aren't we teaching a wider range, a more diverse range of organisation? So I thought that was a really, really sort of thought-provoking point and a good question that maybe we need to, you know, investigate. So even if it's not bulldozing the business school completely, maybe we should be starting to do little things to make sure that we teach a broader, more diverse range of organisation.
Yeah, one of my ex-colleagues wrote a bit about kind of permission and the idea that, you know, within your classroom, you pretty much have permission to do what you want. Right. So, you know, as long as the students aren't throwing books at you and stuff like that, then sure, teach them about co-ops and teach them about, you know, a whole variety of other interesting organizational forms. We don't need to use Harvard case studies in order to do this kind of stuff. More generally, and just wrapping up, I suppose, there is something that's been repeated in these questions about political strategy, isn't it? So I'm kind of betting on either bulldozing the business school or setting up an alternative, the School for Organising. But quite a lot of people are pushing back on that and saying, no, we can't leave the business schools as they are. They need to be occupied by people like us. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but, you know, it's an age-old question, isn't it? Do you try and work on the party from within, or do you pop off and start another political party? Entryism or exodus?
That never-ending question. I think we want to say, first of all, we're going to start wrapping it up. So first of all, thank you very much, Martin, for an absolutely brilliant talk. A lot of people have indicated they've enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Virtual clapping. I thought we were also going to talk a bit about cyber anarchic behaviour I'm quite interested in, but that looks like we might need to organise another session about nerd politics and anarcho cybernetics, because I think there's lots of really interesting work being done there about people who are seriously disrupting some major organisations. But that's for another day. So let the anarchist chat continue. If you would like to join us, if you click on the chat, there's a link to the spatial chat, which will bring you to a virtual space that's like a room, and you can mingle around with different people and try it out and see if it works. Can I also just say thank you very much to all of you for coming and engaging. And we have a whole series of salons prepared for this short before the conference. If we see you in Amsterdam, brilliant. If you're not a member of SASE, would you like to join us? And look forward to seeing you at the next talks. So see you in the spatial chat for those who'd like to come. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you, Jacob, for hosting us all. Thank you for coming. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.